All right, we are live. I am here with Ted Reese, author of Socialism or Extinction, Climate, Automation, and War in the Final Capitalist Breakdown. Ted is a British Marxist. Ted, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on very much.
Okay, so first I wanted to just start with a story of how this came about, because I watched your interview with Ashley on Zero Books, and this notion of the final breakdown that we were in now really piqued my interest. So I looked you up, and I found you on Twitter. I couldn't find much other content from you. I found you on Twitter though, and then it turned out that you were already following me on Twitter. So I was like, this has got to be meant to be or something. So I just decided I'd message you. How
I always follow back.
Do you know how you came to be following me?
I always follow back. So if you
no, you were like, I looked you up and you were already.
But you weren't following me.
Yeah.
Okay, so I must have just randomly liked one of your tweets that got retweeted into my stream. And,
yeah, that's what I think. It was probably a Ben Burgess retweet or that Irish guy, Marxist. What the hell's his name? Badman Massive. Do you follow him?
I don't know.
Okay,
maybe.
Anyway, so you encouraged me to read the book, which is very, very long and very detailed, but I'm glad I did. Basically, it's kind of the most complete book I can remember reading. I think it kind of belongs in a political economy classroom as a full year course. How detailed it is and how it goes through everything. I don't know if you wrote it that way, but it basically outlines the fundamentals of Marxist economics as clarified by Henrik Grossman, capital's falling rate of profit, its crises of overaccumulation, its counter tendencies, the folly of reformism, and then you get into how automation fits in, global warming, and how all these factors were likely mean that we're heading into the final crisis of capitalism. The potential for World War III, neo-feudalism, which you talked with Ashley about a bit, and the necessity for socialist revolution and how it might work. It also does a really good job of preempting virtually every foreseeable counter argument. So it's really quite thorough, but it's kind of written for Marxists, I found. There was a lot of jargon in there that even I had trouble. Even I had to look up, like, what is I had to look up what is a canute, for example.
Oh, well, that's not a Marxist term, but
okay.
No, it just means someone who's sort of in denial about reality.
All right. Well,
it's just like an aphorism or something.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, there were a lot of other ones I had to familiarize.
Yeah, the way the book's written is, I mean, I try to explain things clearly. So I'll use the Marxist term and then try to explain what it means in clearer, less jargony language. But at the same time, I didn't want to assume the reader isn't capable of learning these terms. And I really did I've only been studying Marxism for about 6 years. So I felt like I was writing the book from a perspective of, a fairly new convert, and I was trying to write it in a way that I would. There's a lot of I wish I had known that sooner sort of stuff when you're learning Marxism.
Yeah. I agree.
So I try to write it from that perspective.
But
it's obviously a very difficult task.
Yeah, definitely. It's very analytical too, I found. So, I mean, it's kind of, I was thinking a lot of my left-brained kind of liberal friends might actually be able to dig into this, but a lot of my right brain kind of more creative type friends, I'll just send them Mark Fisher or something and they'll deal with that. I don't know if they can get through all the analytical economistic stuff here.
There is an abridged version out now as well that I published last week, I think. So that's much shorter and much more accessible.
Yeah, that's a good option as well then.
Yeah.
All right. So to clarify some things for normies and answer a bunch of questions, let's start kind of with you give the whole overview of the book. Talk about lay out the theory of breakdown, its inevitability, how we get to the final crisis, socialism, and the hemp economy. Then I have some Marxist economics kind of 101 questions for you to lay out, and I'll get you to debunk a few bad ideas for us. So take it away.
Cool. So yeah, so you want to talk about the final breakdown specifically, or just the general?
No, the whole book, and like I guess starting with the just later.
I mean, it started out as a short essay on automation, because once you sort of accept that Marx was right about the labour theory of value, you sort of start thinking about, well, if we're heading towards a fully automated society, production-wise, then suddenly the source of profit doesn't exist anymore, and capitalism cannot go on. So it sort of started from that. And then I decided to combine what I'd done on sort of my research on the stage of automation that we're at with Henrik Grossman's sort of clarification of Marx, because he talks about the tendency to break down not just capitalism's decaying nature or the tendency to go into recession, but he talks about like an ultimate final breakdown that is inevitable at some stage. And then I just, like, by the time I'd done all that, I just thought, well, I might as well weave in a theory of the climate crisis based on Grossman's theory. Well, obviously Marx and Grossman's theory. And then, yeah, by the time it was all like, it had become this sort of massive project.
Yeah.
I just ended up, I definitely have a problem with like wanting to put everything in, but it was sort of like, we might be running out of time to educate people, and it's a resource for people to learn as much as they can, quickly as they can, because you always hear this stuff like on Twitter, like, just read Lenin, and it's like, well, people might not have time to read Lenin.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, reading, what is to be done, or State and Revolution, is only a small part of the picture. Very narrow and explained one, but yeah, there's definitely more to it. So let's start with, why is labor the only thing that can create value, and why is the labor theory of value correct?
Okay, so in terms of that creating value, we're talking about exchange value, because obviously nature is the source of use value, utility, things that are useful that humans need. But in terms of creating exchange value, if all of our products were made by robots, still made from nature but by robots, no exchange value would be created. So it's the exchange between the capitalist and labour that creates this exchange value under capitalism. So we know that this is correct because the sort of aggregate or historical rate of profit, if you were to do an analysis of a world rate of profit, which someone called Esteban Mato has done, he's shown that the rate of profit is trending in secularly towards zero, and it's much lower now than it was 100 or 150 years ago. So the only way that can be explained is the fact that the more automated production has become, the lower the rate of profit has tended to also become. So there's no other explanation. The subjective theory of value obviously can't explain that phenomenon, and the same goes for all the other theories. This is the reality of what's happening, and I say that automation is abolishing the source of profits, abolishing capitalism, but more accurately, automation is the final expression of capitalism's tendency towards self-abolition.
So Marx was right. In the chat,
Yeah,
they're
Marx
saying
was
that
right.
Sorry, in the chat, they're saying your voice is it's kind of lagging and tripping out. Let's just try without hit that stop cam button and see if that improves things.
Stop cam.
See if that improves your voice coming through.
Okay.
Okay, so given that Marx was right, and we know this now, you wrote the book before coronavirus. So given that the crisis has hit now, can you outline the factors as to why exactly this crisis is different than the crises that have come before, and why it might be the last one?
Okay, so there's a number of like converging tipping points, if you like, which can't be explained by coincidence and which point to a final breakdown. So, firstly, GDP growth rates have been declining over the last 50 years. Like every decade, the GDP rates are slowing down compared to the decade before. Productivity growth in the last decade has been spluttering below 1% in the so-called high-income countries. And then the biggest factor of all is the fact that we've hit 0% interest rates.
Yeah.
And if you look back, it usually takes interest rate cuts of 45% before an economy comes out of recession. But the cuts we've seen only amount to 2%, 2.5% roughly. So there's another 2.5% needed, and there's no room for manoeuvre. They've already come out and said, central banks have come out and said that they don't want negative base rates because it will make the banks unviable. And the reason for this is that it will basically deliver the final devaluation of fiat currency. Because if you look at fiat currency as well, the US dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power since 1913, and British pound sterling 99.5%, and that was in 2011. So British pound sterling is about to go extinct. People are selling off the dollar, or they have been before this crisis hit. Like China, Russia's been diversifying. These are the main means of financing US debt. And then on top of all of that, the debt is now so high that it can never be worked off, even though they're trying to socialize it. And yeah, they're going to have to default on the debt. So when you look at all of those factors, 0% interest rates, flatlining productivity growth, the final depreciation of fiat currency, if there is such thing as a final capitalist breakdown that is insurmountable on capitalist terms, surely it has to be now.
Damn, that's a bleak outlook for capitalism. Thanks for laying that out. Does this bode well for our climate targets now that coronavirus is slowing things down? Might this be something that actually, like these lower production levels and these lower emissions, could this be sustained going forward, or do you think it'll, after the some period of reopening, it'll just bump back up and we'll still have the same problems?
Well, it'll bump back up initially because production will start up again. Mining facilities will reopen. Flights will start going again. I think there'll be a reduction compared to before the lockdown, because I think we're in a depression now. So that would imply that there is going to be a massive lag in terms of restoring growth. Because basically it's becoming increasingly unprofitable to produce anything. So yeah, there's going to be. I mean, we've already seen a dip in emissions and that sort of and pollution. It will go up a bit after the lockdown ends again, but then we're going to see more crashes in the stock market at some point.
So, Ted, are you telling me you don't believe in the miracle V-shaped recovery?
It might be more like a Nike tick initially, and then more like an L.
I didn't write this down actually, but Krugman just wrote a piece on why the stock market has been, in general, going back up, and he's saying that basically, with the Fed throwing in so much liquidity and the rest of the economy looking so terrible, that basically capitalists, I mean, it's the only place for them to put any money at all, so they might as well park it in the stock market.
Yeah, this is it. This is what happens. So you're a productive capitalist. It becomes unproductive to reinvest or even expand that production. So you channel your capital somewhere else, basically into speculation, to try and get a return. And speculation is like the ultimate capitalist competition arena, because they're all trying to rob each other essentially.
Right.
They're all trying to take a bigger. It's like a massive gambling table, where they're all trying to take a bigger share of their competition. It's going to be absolutely insane now.
Right. Okay, so can we let's get a bit into more of what the book talks about, the core of the book, automation, and how that process, especially in the advanced imperialist companies, is leading to trade wars and national economic nationalism.
Yeah, so things are changing. Like with imperialism, the incentive is to export capital overseas to both expand and cheapen the base of labor, the base of exploitable labor. But what we've been seeing in the last, especially in the last 10 years, and it really has picked up, is that factories are being increasingly automated because it's becoming cheaper to automate instead of exploiting labor and expanding the labor base. So, for example, there was one report that said that whereas outsourcing, as they call it, manufacturing to the developing world, quote unquote, saves 65% on costs, automating production saves 90%. And you've got to think like the extra costs that are being saved. So as well as not paying a worker, not paying their sick pay, or their holidays or their pensions, you're also saving on the transport worker that you would have been exploiting, because transport workers are productive. The time they spend transporting a commodity adds to its value. So, and you've also got self-driving vehicles that are sort of coming about sooner than anyone expected as well. So you can now start producing back home, so to speak, because you don't need to exploit, because it's cheaper than exploiting workers overseas. You're saving costs on transit. All of these things make it much more attractive. And then, and not only is it cheaper, you've got no other option, because you're in so much debt that the capitalist has to cut down on these costs to stand any chance of surviving as a private enterprise. So this is happening independent of the will of classes. And so, yeah, what we're seeing is the retreat or the breakdown of so-called globalization, which is, basically imperialism. And that is sort of bringing about, it's bringing about nationalism, but what you're seeing is people like Trump and Boris Johnson sort of ascending to the top of the ruling class table, because the industrialists are sort of the sort of material basis for the dominance of the industrialists is disappearing. So the landowners are becoming more and more the dominant force again, because land is basically treated like a bank. So when you get this surplus capital, as well as channeling it into speculation, you can buy up property, buy up land, and sort of it's like a land bank. It's like somewhere to store their capital while they're waiting for profitable opportunities to return elsewhere. And so you're getting this sort of domestic, sort of the capitalists that are more reliant on the domestic market are sort of becoming dominant again, basically.
Now, so this move towards property, I mean, this explains kind of why, markets like London, Toronto, New York, Vancouver, housing markets are exploding in value, and it's impossible for anybody to live there. Now, so is this kind of a part of a move towards this rent seeking and neo-feudalism?
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't actually talk about neo-feudalism in the book.
Yeah.
I talk more about the possibility of right-wing military dictatorships and fascism. But in terms of rent-seeking, the dominant monopolies are becoming increasingly rent-based, rent-dependent. And what I mean by that is that they need to basically increasingly leech off of the profits that are generated by workers working for smaller capitalist companies. So Amazon is like obviously the best example of this. So effectively, everyone who sells, every company that sort of goes through Amazon is effectively a subsidiary of Amazon. So Amazon doesn't actually make that much stuff, although it has been investing in the oil markets and automation. But it generally, most of the stuff it sells was made by another capitalist. So they take a cut from these other smaller capitalists, and this is a form of rent, and it's just, it's absolutely, it's quite extreme now. And so at the same time as they're becoming dependent on the smaller capitalists, the smaller capitalist is becoming more dependent on them, and effectively the source of this rent is disappearing, is becoming unsustainable.
Now, I think you have a term for this, right? Something parasitic, online landlordism or something?
That's one of the terms I use, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And that applies to more than just Amazon, right?
Yeah, like Facebook. Facebook doesn't make anything. It generates a hell of a lot of data, but most of that's being produced for free by their users. Facebook makes most of its money from advertising. So because people are on Facebook instead of, reading newspapers, people want to advertise on Facebook. So they're dependent on Facebook, but Facebook's dependent on them. So this is another example of rent. You've got Spotify, is making the physical music industry sort of obsolete. People are listening to more music than ever before, but fewer CDs, fewer, whatever it is people used to listen to music on is being made. So physical commodities, are disappearing, and it's the physical commodity that creates profit. So Spotify's never made, I think in 2018 was the only year that Spotify made a profit, and it was expected to be an aberration. So this sort of shows you that this economic model is just completely unsustainable.
Right, right. Yeah, I think I'm gonna ask you a bit about more about immaterial growth a little later on. But
Mm.
let's move on to the first clip here. So, oh, where'd it go? Okay, so in the book, you argue that there is a massive looming debt crisis, and we just talked about that a bit, and that all this extra liquidity dumped in by the Fed um, won't help. It'll probably just make things worse, and it'll likely result in inflation. And you even talk about hyperinflation. But as we all know, a lot of the trend now is to say that debt doesn't matter. The modern monetary theorists have
Yeah.
they have their own idea. I'm going to play a clip, and I'll let you respond to it with regarding debt and hyper and inflation. And this is Adam Tooze and Mark Blythe. So share screen.
Okay.
Okay. What the heck? Oh wait, is that what's going on here? All right. Well, I guess we'll have to do it this way. Okay. Oops, hold on.
The dominant currency in the world. Everyone in the world wants dollars and can use dollars. This crisis has only reaffirmed that. America is not going to be subject to the blackmail of foreign creditors. America is not in the position of a household when it borrows. It is the ultimate global sovereign debtor, if you like. So America is not constrained in the way that an Argentina is, for instance. That's the first issue. Secondly, right now, it's incredibly cheap to borrow because interest rates are low. So even if the debt numbers are huge, the interest rate that the Americans pay on this is derisory. So it's really a small price to pay for investments that are essential right now to sustain life in the US. And the third reason is that once again, we've demonstrated the basic truth in this crisis, as we did in 08-09, which is that public debt is different, because public debt is an asset which is used by everyone for the purposes of long-term investing, for safe investing, and is managed by and has a prime claim on the attention of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. And ultimately, debt which is owed by the federal government, but held by the central bank, is quite literally debt that we owe to ourselves, money that we owe to ourselves. And to the extent that we owe it to ourselves, it's essentially might as well not be a matter of concern, because it shows up on both sides of our public balance sheet. It shows up as a debit on one side of the federal government, but as a credit on the balance sheet of the central bank. So it's just not something that we need to be concerned about. There is a flip side to that, which is the central bank money issued by the central bank in exchange for the debt that it buys. But that, and that could, under certain circumstances, trigger inflation. But we are a million miles away from a world in which inflation of that type is going to happen. So for all of those reasons, we should just not be worrying about debt.
What happens when you bail all this out? Here's the big surprise that nobody wants to talk about in the economics profession. Where the f*** is all the inflation? Because you dumped 20% of the global money supply into the global money supply to save the financial system, and there's no inflation anywhere as traditionally measured. But the anomaly is you've got very low inflation despite these enormous monetary shocks, right? Milton was wrong. It cannot be always an everyday monetary phenomena. And it wasn't. Kalecki was right. It was about labor. And once labor loses its ability to push on its demands in the form of higher wages against the capital share, why would you have inflation? Plus, you've globalized the pool of capital. How do you crowd out the globe? By definition, it's impossible.
Okay. Stop. Oh, shoot. The screen never ended up sharing. Oh, well. We didn't need to see that anyway. You heard that, though, right?
Yeah, I heard it, yeah.
Okay. So respond to Mark and Adam.
So this idea that debt, we shouldn't worry about debt. I mean, firstly, if that was the case, why is it being rising exponentially? And at the same time, why have interest rates been falling? If debt didn't matter, then interest rates wouldn't necessarily fall the way they have done. The US has to finance its debt; it has to repay it, because otherwise, if it can't, it won't have buyers of any debt, and then it will, its economy will collapse. So in the last 10 years or so, China has almost been single-handedly financing US debt. So if debt didn't matter, could the US could just say, oh, actually, we don't want China paying off our debt. It's just ludicrous. In terms of inflation, yeah, it hasn't hit yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, you're sure.
Like they're going to have to consciously bring about inflation, because the thing is that they need to keep. They can't just, the central bank can't just buy up all the debt. It's just ridiculous. The central bank will go bankrupt. And then the IMF would have to bail out the central bank. Let me just read you a bit from. Hang on. This is the thing. The right-wing libertarians understand this better than the Keynesians.
Yeah.
Let me just. So we've got an unprecedented triple bubble in properties, stocks, and assets, and bonds. Sorry, which is essentially debt. Stock prices were at a high of 150% of GDP. This initial crash has seen a 30% puncture in the bubble. If debt didn't matter, none of these things would be happening. We've got all this negative yielding sovereign debt that's just a phenomenon that's never, ever happened before, in trillions of dollars worth. And if they go any lower, the incentive to buy this debt isn't going to exist. So what ended up happening is they're going to have to raise the interest rates just to raise the yield, so that people hold on, the remaining bondholders hold on to it, and to attract new bondholders. So this guy called Michael Pento, who writes...
Oh, your audio is getting weird all of a sudden.
Is it?
It's crackly or something.
Is it? Oh. There's not much I can do.
All right, well, we can still hear you.
You can, okay. Okay, so... basically they're going to have to raise the interest rates to incentivize bond holding, but the problem with that is it's going to raise the debt to GDP even more, which means the tax base is going to shrink relatively again, and eventually they're just going to have to keep carrying on inflating until it hits hyperinflation. Because if they don't, the tax base is going to collapse anyway. So either way, the tax base is going to collapse, basically.
All right. So no matter what, they're screwed.
Doesn't
matter that it's the U.S. is the global reserve currency. They can't get out of this one.
No, the pound was the reserve currency before the First World War, and it didn't survive as the reserve currency. So the US won't survive this time. I don't think there's anything that can replace it this time, though. There's, the reason the Russians and China are diversifying is. They see now that the US is becoming weak. They see it as an unreliable ally increasingly since Trump became president. But also, they're also diversifying because there's just the confidence in the dollar is just being lost generally. But the problem is, but also obviously because of sanctions as well. They're trying to get around sanctions. But the euro's in crisis. The eurozone's in crisis. That leaves China, the Chinese yen. But the only way I could see China basically saving capitalism for another 10 years would be for China to become like just to basically colonize the US and Europe, basically. But I don't think that's possible for several reasons. Obviously, it would spark a world war.
Yeah.
And secondly, you know, a total monopoly under capitalism isn't possible, which is why socialism ends up becoming an economic necessity on a global level.
Right.
But yeah, we'll get hyperinflation. The only way to avoid hyperinflation is to default on the debt through deflation. But they're obviously not going for that, because if they were going to go for that, they wouldn't have bailed out the companies. And when he says, "Oh, we're bailing ourselves out," that's true to some extent in terms of wages for furloughed staff and that sort of thing. But in the main, we're bailing out private enterprise. We're socializing the debt in the trillions of dollars. So his sort of notion that, oh, it's debt that we owe to ourselves is rather fanciful.
Indeed. Okay. All right. The next one. Can you expand on the idea that growth in the periphery nations is not so much a sign of progress as a sign of decay in the rich countries?
Yeah, so as time goes on, as capitalism ages, the imperialist countries, advanced industrialized countries, whatever you want to call them, become increasingly dependent on exporting capital. So Lenin called it monopoly capitalism or imperialism. That was, you know, considered a new definition at the time, based not on the fact that export capital had become a phenomenon, but it had become like a persistent phenomenon, because they used to the advanced industrial countries would export capital, but only sort of in minimal amounts during periods of crisis. But by the time Lenin was writing Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it was becoming a sort of constant, if you like. So yeah, the older the advanced nations get, the more dependent they become on exporting capital, which is why you've seen deindustrialization to the extent you have in countries like the US and Britain. Britain's capitalists are still industrialists, but they own mines in Africa. They own, directly or indirectly, sweatshops in Asia, facilities in China. You know, so that's basically it, because they always need to expand the number of workers that they're exploiting, as well as the sort of rate of exploitation per worker. So yeah, this is why. And if you look at Britain, it's got the lowest. It's long had the lowest rate of profit. So this makes total sense, because it's the oldest capitalist country. So, you know, with the highest, what Marx called the highest organic composition of capital, where basically the total capital is relatively the highest compared to the workforce. So, yeah, that's what it comes down to.
So doesn't that kind of mean then that other countries like China and developing countries, they still have a long time to go before they get down to, you know, the levels of rate of profit that Britain and the United States are approaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, you could look at China, India, Brazil, these sort of like almost advanced developing nations, if you like, that are becoming almost independent of imperialism, and certainly have the confidence to stand up now to countries like the US and Britain. But if you look, the trend is deindustrialization everywhere. It's happening in India, it's happening in China. The hope that Africa and Latin America were starting to become advanced industrial nations, it stopped. The people sort of monitoring this stuff closely are sort of calling it a sort of premature deindustrialization, particularly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. They're already shifting to services-based economies, and it's already being recognized that this is totally stymieing economic growth. So there's this sort of anticipation that all these countries were going to go on the same road as China and India to a certain extent. It's sort of, it's come up against a limit that they didn't foresee, and they're all sort of scratching their heads about it.
Because they didn't read Marx. Okay, before we move on, let's get this straight. You're still sounding a bit like a robot. How about you?
That's probably just my normal voice.
Okay, let's try dropping you from the call and then just click that Twitter link again and try to jump back in, see if that move makes a difference.
Okay.
Sorry about that, guys. He was sounding fine like before. I don't know what happened there. All of a sudden, he just went robot. Oh, the automation got to him. He became a cyborg. All right, so if you guys have questions in the chat, feel free to ask Lord Ted here. Also, read his book. It's really, really good. Look it up. It's like $3 on Kobo right now. I think he's coming out with a paperback eventually, which I would have loved to read. But this is like one of the most complete books I've ever encountered. Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope. Fingers crossed, indeed. Yeah, Ted's really done his research here, and I got a lot of questions for you guys. So hopefully this works out. What's going on here? Why hasn't he not rejoined? Maybe he has to get back on Twitter. Come on, Ted. Where are you? How does oil play into the final breakdown? I mean, oil, it plays into the final breakdown insofar as it's going to squeeze economies just from the fact of the effects of climate change. But I don't think it has any direct effect. The low price of oil might, in some ways, must help the capitalist economy because it'll get things flowing cheaper and more easily. Products will be sold. But it's going to hurt Canada, that's for sure. It might be good. Actually, I don't know who it would be good for. Cheap oil is not good for Venezuela. It's not good for Russia. It's not good for the United States. It's not good for Saudi. Favorite part of his book is I don't know. It's all really good. He basically explains the labor theory of value and Grossman's elaboration on it really well. So I've gone through Capital sort of and Marxist economics like 4 or 5 times. And basically it's that book. I don't have the brain for economics or math, but I think Ted did the best job of laying it out and kind of making you understand accumulation. Oh, here we go.
I've switched to my phone. I don't know if that's going to be any better or not.
Sounds great so far. Okay. You
good.
have the robot voice, so that's awesome. All right. Next up, let's talk about neoliberalism real quick, because you talk about it in the book. And I'm going to share screen here. Okay, so Chomsky and David Harvey, described neoliberalism as a political class project in order to wrestle control of the economy back from the working class. I think you have a different interpretation. I'm just going to play a clip from Chomsky here. Share screen. Please let this work. Your browser has blocked your screen. What? That's fake news. What's going on here? All right, you know what? We don't need to see Chomsky's 90-year-old face.
Okay.
We'll just listen to it. Okay. Here we go.
Been doing for the last 40 years. 40 years ago, under the direction of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, who Reagan, of course, was just a voice for the people who were handing him his scripts from the corporate sector, initiated a new revision of the capitalist system. Now, there had been a period of what was called regimented capitalism. The most self-destructive elements of capitalism were being controlled. Reagan and Thatcher tore that to shreds. We move into the neoliberal era, which is designed, where policy is designed to concentrate wealth, to hand over decision-making from governments, which are at least partially responsive to the population, handed over to private tyrannies, corporations, private tyrannies, which are totally unaccountable to the population and whose goal solely is greed. That's the official doctrine handed down by Milton Friedman, Chicago economists. Corporations have no role, may not do anything except maximize their own profit.
Okay, so was neoliberalism a doctrine handed down by Milton Friedman and the capitalist class? Was it a project?
Well, kind of, but you've got to remember what was the driving force behind it. Let's go back to the end of the Second World War. At that point, they needed Keynesianism for all sorts of reasons, but they needed, socially they needed it to ward off revolution, but they also needed it economically because there weren't that many capitalists left. There wasn't the ability for private capital to rebuild the country, or whether it was the US or Europe, not US particularly, but mainly Europe. So by the end of sort of the 60s, the middle class was sort of growing again quite significantly relative to the size of the working class. Then you get a crisis in the early 70s, the crisis of accumulation, which has happened despite Keynesianism being
they didn't do Keynesianism right. They didn't implement it totally.
Well, yeah, this is the argument, isn't it? It's like there's never enough Keynesianism. So what they had to do was what capitalists always have to do, which is destroy, cheapen, centralize capital in sufficient quantities. And by this point, the capitalist class has been re-strengthened compared to the end of the war. There's now more capitalists. Keynesianism has effectively saved capitalism and paved the way, inevitably, for neoliberalism. So yes, it was a political project carried out by a specific class, a specific section of the ruling class, and it was fairly easy to do it because the middle classes were so sort of like such a big proportion in the imperialist countries by this point that you only had to attack a sort of small section of the middle class and as well as the rest of the working class and sort of re-proletarianize that section. That there wasn't that much resistance to it. So you had in Britain anyway, I mean, especially in Britain. So in Britain, you had the massive relatively massive miners' strike. But it was very easy for them to divide the working class. So, they would incentivize one section of the miners to sort of carry on working by giving them shares in the privatized industries and allowing them to buy their socially owned house and that sort of thing. So it was very easy to split the working class. And unfortunately, the miners didn't really have the support of the wider working class, because by that point, a lot of the working class was quite, really relatively privileged. So, and this idea he has that democracy was thriving under social democracy. Relatively speaking, but these countries were still imperialist. They were still starting wars. They were still, flattening North Korea, countries in Africa that were fighting for independence. So, yeah, it's a bit. There's some truth to what he says, but that's not the whole story.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for answering my next couple questions. Reading your book, I could see where people might accuse you of economic determinism or economism. But like you said, it's kind of both a political class project and also a necessary and inevitable development of capitalism. It had to go that way.
Yeah, I would say with absolute confidence that the economic factor comes first, and I'm not shy of saying that. I'm not. Marx and Engels saw class struggle as the sort of necessary manifestation of the economic development. So, like I say, you get an accumulation crisis, and it becomes necessary to attack the working class. This is what a lot of anarchists just refuse to accept. Their theory tends to be that the capitalists attack the working class just out of like some sort of spite or hatred. And yeah, there are obviously a lot of capitalists that do hate the working class, and all the rest of it, but they actually quite like social peace because it's the best conditions for making a profit under. A lot of companies just don't want to go bust, and they want their workers to be happy, so that they are making the most so that they're being the most productive as possible. It's only once an accumulation crisis starts that they tend to start laying people off and all the rest of it.
All right, great. You also just answered my next two questions, which is perfect. Good job. Okay, so David Harvey, which we just spoke about, thinks imperialism is not a useful category and only applied to a historical period ending in around the 70s or 80s. So you use imperialism a lot. What is imperialism, and is it a relevant category?
Yeah, I still think it's a relevant category because, there are economists that I really respect that share this opinion with Harvey, such as Paul Cockshott, who says that we just have an integrated capitalist system, with all the countries trading with each other. And in a sense, like the countries being exploited by sort of export capital, that they do tend to welcome the sort of opportunities that brings in terms of industrializing their country, creating jobs and all the rest of it. But when you get down to it, like it's still a relative handful of countries that are sort of the dominant countries that are constantly exporting capital, constantly investing overseas. You get other economists saying things like, well, the imperialist countries invest in a lot in each other as well. Sort of really understand why the US has the biggest military on earth. For example, you need to understand it's not just because it's the richest country. Because if you just look at that, you think, oh well, it's the richest country because it's the biggest country, but it's not actually the biggest country, and it's just an insufficient explanation. So I think the category of imperialism is still useful.
Okay, one last one on neoliberalism. You say in the book that neoliberalism is basically one step removed from fascism. So explain that one.
Yeah, so I think we saw this in Chile most sort of starkly. Neoliberalism is only possible because the state becomes increasingly powerful. There's this, they shrink the state is shrinking in terms of increasing surveillance, of the population, and the sort of
but specifically the
again,
working class.
Yeah, specifically the working class, but the privileged sections of the working class and the middle class are also being proletarianized or ruined, lumpenized perhaps. So yeah, I see neoliberalism as progressively more fascistic, essentially.
Potential of UBI to save us from automation. This is
it is being produced to preserve the value of total capital. So you get an overaccumulation. So the system breaks down partially and temporarily into a recession, and that is resolved by destroying, cheapening, centralizing capital in sufficient quantities. That means they need to spend a form of the wage. So it tends to go up, whether they like it or not, which means they need to decrease the amount of benefit. These attacks on benefits that we've seen are absolutely necessary. We're talking about pensions as well in this context. The coronavirus is a gift for capitalists because the preference of pensioners as a necessary evil for the accumulation of capital. And that's one of the reasons the response to the coronavirus has been so dreadful. If they were going to implement it, it would have to be
wipe them out or find a way to bring that money back too. I mean, so there's lots of kind of gluts out there that have been, taken down by neoliberalism, and all these tax rates have gone down. Why can't we pay for pensions just by taking the taxes up?
It might work for a little while.
Right.
It might work for a few years. I mean, in one sense, it's useful for capitalism because taking wealth away from some capitalists is a way of centralizing capital, right, into the hands of fewer capitalists.
Yeah.
And they'll try and do that at the same time as making life a bit more bearable for everyone else, because they need people to work. They need people to be healthy enough to work. But yeah, they tried to redistribute wealth a bit in favor of the working class, but it was only sustainable for a few years.
Okay, I think that kind of answers my next question too. You mentioned stock buybacks in the in the book, and they're kind of in the news now. But I mean, you in a sense you just answered the question of couldn't they just reinvest the instead of doing the stock buybacks, couldn't they just put it back into their company or reinvest? But actually, no, they need to. This isn't a matter of greed. This is kind of a matter of necessity, right?
Yeah, I'm sure, like, from the perspective of the person receiving a buyback, they're rubbing their hands together and saying, isn't greed good? Probably. but in terms of the driving force behind it, greed isn't the driving force. Greed is another symptom, I would say, predominantly anyway, perhaps not completely, but yeah, that whole phenomena is another symptom of sort of the increase in unproductive labour, I suppose.
Okay. Ooh, this is a fun one. All right. And so in what seems like a bit of a pot shot at Trotskyists, you argue that the Labour Party in Britain is completely irredeemable, pretty convincingly. So what do you make of the claim that the American left must use the DNC, the Democratic Party, because third parties face too many obstacles? And what's wrong with the strategic entryism?
Yeah, so I can understand why a lot of people have been trying this for decades and decades. But again, we've seen with Sanders that they're just pulling out all the stops to defeat Sanders. So how is this? I can't see a way of transforming the party. I mean, in the last chapter of the book, I do talk about a sort of a united front with like the possibility of a united front with the left of the Democratic Party and the left of the Labour Party in very, very unique circumstances. Brought about by the fact that this is probably capitalism's final breakdown. But until we get to that point, we really need to be building outside. We really need an independent party that understands why everything that's happening is happening, and sort of can put forward a really proletarian position and the argument forcefully for actual socialism, because that's not going to happen from these left social democrats. They're going to talk about nationalizing things here and there, and they're going to talk about the failures of neoliberalism, but they're not going to explain to people coherently. They're not even going to attempt to explain to people why capitalism itself is failing and breaking down and cannot be recovered this time. So we absolutely need independent working class institutions, and especially a socialist communist, an independent socialist communist party. I mean, I have a dig at Trotskyists, but you don't get me wrong, I've got plenty of digs for Leninists as well. Because Leninism isn't, it's not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, neither is Trotskyism.
Yeah. But
because I mean, a lot of Trots would agree with what you just said. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I don't think anybody's argued. Well, I don't know how it is in Britain, but here they argue that we shouldn't be really. There's no point in engaging in these political parties like the NDP in Canada or the Democratic Party until the point where the working class movement is strong enough to actually have some influence in those parties. And once that does happen, once the capitalist breakdown kind of necessitates that, then it will make sense to engage in the Democratic Party or the Labour Party or the NDP. But until then, it's there's no basis for it. There's no point in putting all our eggs in that basket if there's no working class movement pressuring them from the Marxist left.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, in Britain, the Trotskyists in Britain mainly are actually members of the Labour Party and have been for a long time. So they've always advocated voting for Labour, no matter how regressive or imperialist it's been, warmongering it's been. They would still call for a vote for Blair, for example, when he was Labour leader. you know, I'm not like this sort of absolute anti-Trotskyist though. I'm very open to as large a section of the left, the communist left. I really want to see this actually putting differences aside and working out how we can work together, because all the old arguments are disappearing. And this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. You know, if we're in a final breakdown and socialism is now an absolute economic necessity, a lot of the old arguments basically become irrelevant. And we've got to find a way of basically putting sectarianism aside, because the more divided we are, the weaker we are.
Yes.
That's a hell of a difficult task, because of all the old aggravations and everything. But it's a big topic, probably best reserved for another
Yes,
discussion.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm even hearing anarchists, prominent anarchists, YouTubers calling for platformism and what's the word I'm looking for? Strategic. What the hell is it called?
Alliances.
Yeah. With Leninists and Trotskyists. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it is great. And the funny thing is, you get other anarchists who are like who look at that and say, oh, that's heresy.
Yeah.
Of course, we have to work together. Anyway, next question. Let's debunk some more libertarian crap here. So my bourgeois friends here. I can't get this up on screen. I have a group chat with some of my friends who are in a stock market kind of just a group chat, and after I posted your interview, they renamed the group to make fun of me. They renamed the group The Final Crisis. So one of the things they mentioned was, okay, so they think that we just need a centralized artificial intelligence to provide essentials for everybody, like food, health, healthcare, cheap education, cheap housing, education. Then we'll all be good, and capitalism will just kind of naturally fizzle into this utopian kind of tech AI run utopia.
Yeah. I mean, that's in a way what communism, what the socialist road to communism is like. But you can't do it under capitalism. You can't take a purely capitalist road to the higher stage of communism, where we have sort of automatic planning of everything, because because you get a final breakdown, because capital doesn't accumulate harmoniously. So that means we get a final breakdown before, like much earlier than a zero rate of profit, much earlier than the rate of profit just sort of seamlessly sort of falling down gently towards a zero rate of profit, where we get fully automated production. You need a socialist stage, or the lower stage of communism, to get to fully automated production. Because the system will break down. The profit incentive has disappeared at this point, so there won't be any production, let alone any sort of completion of automation. So this is absolutely why you need the socialist transitionary period. I mean, I do think that there won't be a need for state capitalism. I think we'll be able to go straight into the lower stage of communism, especially in the imperialist countries, actually. I think the imperialist countries are riper. That was Marx's initial assessment. And now that we're at the point where they are already very highly automated, their rates of profit are incredibly low. They're post-industrial. They've got a digital, they've got the digital technology. You've got the internet. You've got the stop coding that the Soviet Union didn't have. You've got all the technology you need to really plan the economy from the get-go. The only problem would be, would a socialist country come under attack from an external source? But I'm getting into into very specific territory here, because I think we're going to see a world revolution.
Nice.
Within the next 10, 20 years. I don't see, barring a world war,
which might happen.
A world war is the only thing that can stop a global socialist revolution, I think, because it would, destroy the planet. But yeah, so I don't see a period of, fiat currency is dying a natural death, so to speak, as we've seen. Then I don't see a period of state capitalism that the Bolsheviks sort of ended up pursuing, and that arguably China has been pursuing for the past 30 years. I don't see that being necessary. I see a very quick transition into the sort of thing that Marx describes in Critique of the Gotha Program, where he talks about labor vouchers, because I think you could have like a digital voucher system now, because of course you still need to incentivize work during the period of completing the historical trend to fully automated production.
Right. Well, okay, so a counter-argument, a libertarian or bourgeois counter-argument might be that, well, with the way technology is improving, soon we'll be able to mine asteroids, and we'll have space capitalism, and we'll go on the moon, and there'll be so much, here, I have a quote here, iron and even a whole bunch of other minerals, gold, literally unlimited supply. Some say Earth would become like a park or a sanctuary, with all our pollution being in outer space. My libertarian friend literally believes this. So how do you respond to space capitalism?
Okay, so space capitalism is only going to work if you put loads and loads and loads of workers on these asteroids and exploit them. Because capitalism depends on the exploitation of human labor. Right. So yeah, and I've read the costs of asteroid mining, and they're like astronomically, so to speak, massive, because that's how much the production costs would be. So the book counters this, actually, because I mean, the whole my analysis of the climate crisis is that because of the increasing need to exploit labor, the labor intensity of extraction makes it necessary, and increasingly so, for capitalism, which is why you've got this climate crisis, because you're destroying the environment, releasing the emissions into the atmosphere, and so on. Whereas socialism, the economic model would be based on utility production instead of commodity production. So you produce all your products, but they're no longer commodities; they're utilities, and that gives us the option, at least, of no longer extracting, having an extraction-based model of production. and this is where hemp comes in. So for thousands of years before capitalism, and especially before monopoly capitalism, hemp was used for food, fuel, clothing, construction, other forms of production, medicine. But it became unprofitable. First of all, hemp's versatility was a threat to the extraction-based industries because of versatility, but also it's very cheap to produce. It's not labor intensive to produce, so it's not that profitable. And they've only started re-legalizing hemp production in the last 10 years because all the extraction-based industries have become so capital intensive, and they're all mired in debt and they're not particularly profitable anymore. So under socialism, the fact that hemp-based production isn't labor intensive isn't a problem.
No.
Because where we have an economic model where exchange value is based on utility.
Okay, so I have a question. We have a question here from chat. Okay, we only have less than 11 years to prevent the climate breakdown. What do you think will happen after that, if we get there? They predict this will cause at least 150 million migrants for 2050.
It's impossible to say what's going to happen, but parts of the world are becoming increasingly uninhabitable. What we really, really need a hemp-based industrial revolution, because the thing about hemp is it rapidly draws down CO2 from the atmosphere faster than any other plant or tree, and it also heals the soil. And there's already people working in the UN who are working with the UN, who are trying to legalize hemp in Africa because they see it as the key to reversing desertification. The prohibition of hemp has been devastating for Africa. It's almost like the root cause of the desertification, because what you've had is there's large swathes of the country that don't have access to electricity, so they've had to use wood for cooking fuel and for domestic fuel. So that's necessitated deforestation at an unsustainable rate. So it's now got to the point where they people even in the UN are saying, we've got no choice, we need to legalize hemp so that there's a source of fuel, because you can make briquettes out of it. You could, much cleaner than coal. You can make biofuel out of it, much cleaner than petrol and diesel. So yeah, that's what needs to happen. And until that happens, I think the state of the climate will continue to probably get worse. I mean, the only thing is with economic growth sort of going in decline, not just stagnating now, but going in decline. As we said earlier, there might be a drop in emissions, but that's going to come at the cost of the immediate human need. So, it's we need socialism, especially to save the planet.
Yeah, you do a really good job of outlining how hemp is really the miracle plant, basically, and that socialism is going to have to run on it. So a couple questions there. What if we didn't have hemp? Would we just be fucked? And you don't mention nuclear at all. I mean, would we without hemp? Would it have to be nuclear fusion or fission?
Yeah, and to be honest, I've read up a bit more on nuclear since reading the book, and I would have included some stuff on that. I think from what I've read recently, nuclear is a lot safer than I thought, to be honest. So I think nuclear is a good option. And particular, I think it's thorium,
Thorium, yeah.
which is a sort of less radioactive.
Yeah, there's a debate about thorium though, whether it's.
I don't know. Go on, carry on.
Well, I mean, some people like there's a lot of people on the internet who, well, not on the internet. There's a lot of people who are very pro thorium. You know, why aren't we doing thorium right now? But then there's a whole other argument that's saying, well, it's not really feasible at all in terms of cost and research and the time it will take to develop.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about cost, I mean, I read that it doesn't really need to be enriched. So I'm assuming that's why it hasn't been used, because it's less labor intensive to produce. I can't say that for sure, but that seems like a solid theory. Okay. But yeah, I think nuclear is an option, because the thing about obviously a hemp-based transition is it's going to take time. I mean, hemp grows incredibly quickly, but there's still a limit to how much you can grow based on how much land you can dedicate to it, the time of the year, and all the rest. It's going to take a decade or so to produce enough of it to start living off of hemp-based batteries and biofuel and everything else that we'll need it for.
Right.
And that's on a global level. If the whole globe is socialist and the whole globe is having a hemp-based transition, or a transition to a hemp-based production, it's still going to take, you would have thought, at least 10 years or so before that transition is sort of like really becoming the predominant mode of production.
Right. So anyone watching this might be like, well, why the hell hasn't he talked about wind and solar? And speaking of that, did you end up watching the Michael Moore produced documentary?
Not yet. No, I haven't had a chance.
Okay. Well, I mean, you outlined basically the same things in the book, except that the documentary talks a bit more about biomass and how that's basically just fake news, green energy, and how these forms of energy are so extraction intensive that basically they don't really save us anything in terms of or much at all in terms of emissions reductions.
Yeah, they only save emissions once they've been built. They're not a wind turbine isn't directly polluting the atmosphere, but building it is, because it's a heat and energy intensive way of producing. It still relies on fossil fuel to fuel that production. It still depends on mining the earth for all the materials that get used to build the solar panel or the wind turbine. Again, though, you can build wind turbines and solar panels out of plants, predominantly hemp. But the reason they're not doing that is because it's not profitable. So.
Okay. So Ted, can we have, you talk about this in the book, can we have fully automated luxury gay space communism?
I would call it communism, and it inherently incorporates all of these other things.
But what's the problem with the book, though? The way they frame it in.
What, fully automated luxury communism?
Yeah.
Okay, so Aaron Bastani uses. The problem is he uses it as a rhetorical. It's mainly rhetorical. It's not based in any kind of political economy, or not a serious or flawless one. I mean, he's a market socialist, which is just another way of saying capitalism. The problem is not that communism would be fully automated. The problem is that the way he suggests doing it would destroy the planet. Because as we've established, like the way that the Green New Deal wants to decarbonize the economy is via further expanded extraction on a pretty much exponential basis. So, so that's one problem with it. I mean, he talks about asteroid mining as well. The other problem is that his sort of capitalist road to communism is an imperialist road, which guarantees wars over resources in the developing world, the countries that are exploited by imperialism. So I can't support his I can't really support his sort of version of going forward either, but on that basis, because not only does it affect the people living in those countries in terms of spoiling their environment and generating wars over resources that have to be mined. In the end, it would generate a world war as well. So it's in our interests to be anti-imperialist.
All right, good. You're answering questions.
It's not just a moral. Yeah, it's not just a moral thing. I mean, I think it is a moral thing, but it's also in our interests to be anti-imperialist, because imperialism is destroying the world, destroying the environment, and it also threatens a world war, which would be absolutely cataclysmic now.
Not in our interests, right? Yeah. I'm going to ask a bit more about that later. Okay, so last week, the U.S. just released UFO footage. How do aliens affect the class struggle, Ted?
I found I did laugh when I saw that story because it seemed incredibly conveniently timed.
Yeah.
If you want to put it in if you want to sort of analyze it seriously, it's some sort of diversionary tactic, I would say. That's about all it comes down to. It's
CIA, psyops.
Probably.
I mean, I do think it's likely they have the military has technology far beyond what we know. I mean, given just like if you're really into UFOs and some of the advanced technology that's being talked about, then that's what they think. They think the military, these are all just military craft that they haven't, for some reason, haven't really. I mean, maybe because it's not profitable. Maybe capitalism is the problem with holding all this alien tech back.
It is because it's just so expensive to develop the most advanced technology. And this is the thing, it's the most advanced technology is almost always developed by the state, paid for by the state, i.e. by the public, by the working class. So the state will develop it, and then the private sector will sort of repackage it and sell it, and the profit is privatized. So the idea that the private sector is the more innovative sector is baloney.
That's fake news.
Yeah.
Right. So
right,
right, it's official. Capitalism is holding us back from alien space technology. All right. So that's why we need to end it. So join a socialist party if you're into that. Okay. No, we can skip that. We went over nuclear. Oh, here's a fun one. Okay. Jason Hickel. You know Jason Hickel?
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, I don't think he's a Marxist, but he's a left-ish economist. So him and feminist economist Marilyn Waring think our mistake is the focus on GDP and growth. That's the mistake of capitalism. The latter proposing a new system of national accounts entirely, and to add domestic production to the balance sheets. Nancy Fraser also echoes this call to make domestic production part of the balance sheet. Prime Minister of New Zealand promised to abandon GDP growth as an objective. So they're suggesting that by changing our accounting methods, we can simply work and buy less and invest in public services instead, with the added bonuses of no longer needing war capitalism and imperialism to fuel growth. Is this reality?
It's very it's a very convoluted way of saying we need socialism. Basically, like it's almost like they're trying to sneak socialism in through the back door or something. The problem I see with it is, I mean, it's not socialism because I'm not against economic growth.
Good.
Economic growth reduces scarcity, makes life more comfortable for more people. This is the problem with capitalism. It can't keep going. If you look at the last 50 years, living standards have risen for probably most people, actually, on relative terms. Like the fraction of people going hungry in the world has actually consistently been reduced, because the thing with the sort of the last 50 years is the size of the economy has, like, throughout capitalism, the size of the economy tends to double every 20 years, but then it's doubling from an already doubled state, like every 20 years again. So we've seen absolutely massive expansion of the size of the economy, like almost the entire size of the economy has sort of happened after the Second World War, if you like, and the improvements to technology tend to double, or computing power tends to double every 2 years.
Although
so
that's
it's coming up against economic limits now. So, like, there has been progress, and sort of the trajectory capitalism is on is, if you forget the fact that it inherently breaks down, the trajectory is towards abundance for all, but it can't finish the job. It's now coming up against the absolute limits of its own material basis, and that's why I'm saying that socialism is becoming an economic necessity for the first time. So the problem with economic growth is not that economic growth isn't destroying the planet. It's the fact that the economic model that we have is dependent on extraction for its growth, whereas socialism would have the option. There's no guarantee, because we need to make the conscious decision to switch to something like a hemp-based economy and to nuclear, and end extraction, but it gives us the option to do that, whereas capitalism absolutely depends on extraction. So yeah, growth isn't the problem. It's the basis of growth that's the problem.
Right. So yeah, the fact that GDP is a measure of, a country's, not the fact that the idea that the GDP is the measure of a country's ability to do war fighting is irrelevant to the picture. It comes down to production. And
yeah, and the thing about socialism is it's obviously not a for-profit model. It's a break-even model, but that doesn't mean you don't have economic growth, because you just produce more than before, but still on a break-even basis.
Yeah, right.
Because the more efficient and productive the productive forces become, which is a historical thing as much as anything. The productive forces will always keep progressing historically, no matter what the mode of production. So, yeah, like, economic growth isn't going away, and apart from the fact that capitalism is now collapsing.
All right. Well, let me put this to you, all you Marxist economists. You're just missing something. that the clown libertarian economists are pointing out here. So I apologize if this sounds like total gibberish. So this is what they say. There are two types of people. We have owners and workers, and money equals energy. For some reason, money management is energy, and energy is money management equals energy management or power. So socialism can't work, because if everyone had an equal amount of energy, then large projects are not possible. If you have enough energy funneling up, then you can get individuals that create larger and larger projects and infrastructure. And as you go up the pyramid, in most cases, those who have made large sums of money or energy have contributed more than others, because of, capitalism is a meritocracy, obviously. So yeah, respond to that libertarian fantasy.
I don't know where to start.
That's kind of what I said too when I heard that. So I'm
the thing is, yeah, I mean,
money,
capitalism, money, energy. The capitalist is a parasite, right? The capitalist is doing sort of. I'm not saying capitalists don't work hard and don't do things, but they don't create exchange value, right? They don't create profit. They do a sort of administrative task where they put the pieces in place to build their companies, and oversee organization, but they don't create an exchange value. They exploit the working class. They essentially take time off of the working class. They take value, which is the surplus value, the surplus labor time, away from the working class and keep it for themselves, and put it towards their own consumption and the maintenance and expansion of their business enterprises. So yeah, and but again, this argument is just sort of almost becoming obsolete now, because there aren't going to be any capitalists left. They're all going to go bust, and that's when the penny will drop.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be organized enough to by that time. Some of them will say that we can avoid the problem of finite resources by simply shifting to immaterial production, software, video games, media. Everything's on computers and internet now. Why can't that work? Why can't we learn to code? Everybody just learn to code, and we all create immaterial production, and that'll save capitalism.
Well, I think you know the answer to this one, which is that obviously none of this stuff exists in thin air. It's it's all stored on massive servers. You need electricity and fuel to keep it up and running 24/7, so on and so on. So yeah, you need a sustainable system of production that's not killing the earth to be able to sustain that anyway.
Well, I mean, what if capitalists suddenly realize or figure out how to go to nuclear fission and supply energy to do this? Could that not work?
Not if it's not exploiting enough workers, then it's not going to generate enough profit. The thing is, data's the most profitable resource in the world now, which is just extraordinary. I mean, it tells you the state of the oil industry, but you have to generate so much data and bundle so much of it together for it to be worth anything, because most of it's being created for free by people on the internet, or sort of detection computers that can detect signals and everything like that. So again, this is a symptom of a rent-based economy that's unsustainable.
So people talk about digital bills of rights. as a kind of a solution to this looming neo-feudal surveillance state capitalism. But would that not just kind of, I mean, this is the only place capitalists are getting profit now. So would that not just bring the crisis closer?
Yeah, it'll just coincide with an intensification of the crisis. So you can have a digital bill of rights, but if you've got no money, you've got no rights. And there's going to be more and more people that don't have any money. So that's the problem.
Right. So this stopping this kind of data economy and surveillance won't matter.
Sorry, say that again.
So putting a stop to this kind of data economy and surveillance capitalism won't matter.
Putting a stop to it.
Well, yeah, that's what the digital bill of rights would do.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that wouldn't. I mean, that would be a problem for capitalism, because capitalism needs to innovate and it needs to keep making everything more efficient, production more efficient, the circulation of capital more efficient, the turnover of capital more efficient. It always needs to speed up all of these processes just to keep the accumulation of capital going.
Okay, so I have lots of not lots, but I have anarchists in my subscribers. Why are anarchists wrong? Aren't states inherently corruptible, coercive, and bureaucratic? Isn't the Vanguard Party much of the same, kind of top down, inevitably turn repressive? And haven't anarchists proved their ability in fighting imperialists and fascists before?
Well, yeah, I respect anarchists for the actions they've taken in the past, and you can understand some of their analysis of communist states, but it's divorced from theory. You have to look at I mean, obviously, it's easy to say, oh, the socialist states were the way they were because they had to repel external counter-revolution. So they weren't really as great as they could have been. And they were sanctioned a lot. So that made things hard for them. And that's all true. And then you can say, and the party was corrupted and there was a bureaucracy that was corrupted. Again, though, like I said earlier, I don't think any period of state capitalism is going to be necessary. I think we're going to be going straight into a digital voucher system that would virtually abolish corruption straight away, because a voucher system would be non-transferable. So once you spend it, it gets cancelled. You can't swap your vouchers with other people. So the only way to corrupt it would be through hacking. So you'd obviously need a foolproof system, or as best as foolproof as possible. But I think the sort of decentralized nature of it would make that possible, because you're talking about, everyone having a sort of, like a credit card, like where you keep your voucher points on, or your voucher credit on. So yeah, the problem with the Soviet Union was not only that it was isolated and under attack, it had to trade with capitalist countries, which meant it couldn't fully plan its economy, because it can't predict the foreign prices that would have been fluctuating from other countries. That also made it, kind of logical to have a black market, because they needed to build up foreign currency to be able to trade with capitalist countries. So this sort of undermined the ability to plan. They didn't have the technology in terms of computing power and stock coding that we have now, which would have also made it more difficult. So all of the sort of anarchist arguments about the Soviet Union, whether they're true or not doesn't really matter. I'm sure there were lots of corrupt socialists. In fact, there was when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were lots of defectors, in the KGB. But this is why we can't focus on human nature as an obstacle to socialism. In the future, it's not going to be possible to have a corrupt bureaucracy, I don't think. It's not going to be possible to sanction other countries. All of these problems that the Soviet Union had and North Korea have had and Cuba have had. You could even say that China sort of regressed from, whether you agree, I'm not saying I agree with Dengism, but you can say that, if you want a sort of dispassionate analysis, you can sort of see that state capitalism became necessary as a way to prevent, absolute imperialist domination, prevent absolute collapse. So, but again, I don't see the problems that socialist states had in the past as being massive barriers. We can be conscious of them. We should be, skepticism is always healthy, but these analyses have to be based on, solid theory, a solid understanding of the context and history.
All right. Well, that kind of leads into next question here, which is going to annoy you. That you're talking about how socialism will basically solve a lot of these problems just kind of in and of itself. So I just want to note that in all, I guess 450. How many pages is your book?
It's something like that, yeah, 450
yeah, around
pages.
450 pages. I didn't hear a peep about white supremacy and the patriarchy, which both predated capitalism, don't you know? So you say that, we see that understanding the world's problems depends on understanding the labor theory of value. Aren't you being a class reductionist by suggesting that oppression of minorities will simply cease under socialism, and that oppression is rooted in economics?
Well, firstly, I didn't say that it would simply cease. I said the opposite. I said it would. I said racism, sexism, and so on will not disappear the night after a socialist revolution. What should disappear is, state-sanctioned discrimination, mostly, because what we should do after having a socialist revolution is write a new constitution and have it democratically negotiated with all the people, and include in that constitution equal rights for everyone. But not everyone's going to get everything they want, because the working class isn't homogenous, and sections have different interests. But what we can say is that racism and sexism and so on are going to become increasingly something of the past, because as we've seen in the last 10 years, society becomes meaner when scarcity rises. So socialism is going to reverse that process. So society will get kinder, so to speak. So that's the first thing. I think we also need a transition to communal-based living, which I think will have to be incentivized, because you can't just force people to stop being religious, stop identifying as a certain gender, all the rest of it, which is, I'm sure everyone appreciates that. No one's arguing the opposite. I'm not trying to make a straw man there. but it's going to take a transition, and that's going to have to be an incentivized transition with tax breaks and so on. But yeah, when you get to the crux of the issue, white supremacy is a symptom of capitalism. It's reproduced by capitalism, because, for example, immigration is largely sort of determined by the needs of capital at a given time. So the needs of capital can change. So if you've got an oversupply of labour, you don't want more you don't want more immigration from the point of view of the capitalist, and vice versa. And then there's different sections of capital who have different needs. So that's the thing. So when a new wave of immigrants come into the country, they're obviously going to have less rights under a capitalist imperialist country than the rest of the working class. So that creates a new layer of super exploited workers in the imperialist country, and they have less rights, they have less support from trade unions and so on.
So it's structural.
So it reproduces a structure of racism. So yeah, I'm not saying by any stretch that cultural racism will go away straight away after socialism.
But the class relations do reproduce these systems of oppression. So
under capitalism, yeah. I mean, all of these things, right? In the final analysis, they will wither away. They won't. I absolutely think we should consciously challenge them as well, and culturally challenge them by, for example, changing the curriculum and that sort of thing. But it's going to take a generation or two before things get, more to the sort of stage we want. And ultimately, race will wither away as a political, economic category. Race, gender, sexuality, these things will probably start to wither away, and who knows if we have world socialism after 50 years of world socialism, the demographics will look so different, that these categories might be, completely irrelevant by then.
Right, I agree. So we're coming up on 2 hours. I just want to I'm going to put in one or two more questions here. To round it out, what does eco-socialism look like, and what can Cuba teach us about it?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, Cuba's really interesting because its sort of pivot towards eco-socialism was kind of necessitated by the fall of the Soviet Union. It lost, I can't remember the figure, whether it was something like 60% of its trade, something like that. Its GDP obviously fell quite dramatically, and they had to go through what they called the special period, and they shifted production they tried to revert to a more local basis for production. So you've seen the emergence of sort of urban agriculture and that sort of thing, which has, Havana produces 90% of its own food now. And this has meant, that there's less need for transporting food around the country, emissions significantly. But they are also, buying solar panels and things from China, and it's a slow process. Still, quite a lot of from the cars. It's a bit of a throwback. But yeah, they're doing very interesting things, and their biotechnology sector as well is a world leader. So, I mean, they haven't done anything with hemp, but that's to be expected because they wouldn't be able to grow enough on their own. This is why I talked about Africa.
Right.
Africa could essentially become the workshop of the world under socialism, because it would have the capacity for growing so much hemp along with Asia.
Okay. Finally, and most importantly, with the final breakdown imminent, what should I be investing in if I want to survive the next few decades? Where should my money go? You mentioned gold.
That's what they're saying, isn't it? The libertarians are saying buy gold, buy precious metals, hard assets. But I think they're also saying it's already too late. It's all been bought.
So there's nothing. We're just
well,
we've got
a credit crunch, so that's the problem. They were saying don't leave it too late. But yeah, it's not going to matter. Whatever they buy, it's gonna become worthless.
Oh, okay. Well, that's reassuring. Thanks, Ted. Okay, I think that's it for now. We basically covered everything, more or less. Is there anything you want to plug? And are we getting a paperback version of your book soon?
There's a paperback of the abridged version will be ready very shortly, hopefully within a week. The full version is taking longer to put together as a paperback because it's much bigger. So yeah, just buy the book, recommend the book, promote the book, because it's self-published and I don't have any institutional backing or support from any sort of publisher or anything. So it's literally a word of mouth project. And yeah, if you're getting into socialism, if you're starting to question the system, it's the quickest way, maybe, or one of the quickest ways of working it all out. And as I say, I try to write it for people who want to try and learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible, in the context of the situation we're in.
Yeah, well, it certainly is thorough. All right, so yeah, hear that? Anybody watching or in the chat, buy Ted's book and spread it. Spread the news. Spread the good word. All right, thanks for doing this, Ted. That took that was 2 hours. We got through basically everything. Thanks
for having me on.
All right, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's it. We'll leave now.
Cool. If you want to do this again sometime, let me know.
Okay. Yeah, I might have further questions. All right. Thanks.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.